Whether you played the original version of Final Fantasy XII way back on the PlayStation 2, or you're playing it for the first time thanks to the Zodiac Age, which of course released quite recently, the Gambit system is really something to marvel at, both in terms of design but also execution. Some might argue that by its very nature, the Gambit system can take the fun out of the gameplay side of things. After all, the system is designed around the automation of tasks such as combat and other activities. But personally, I feel as though the joy and satisfaction of the Gambit system instead comes from seeing your carefully laid out plans being executed to perfection. Sure, it's not foolproof, there are of course some limitations, but despite its rather crude and basic interface, the Gambit system can be very powerful in the right hands. It's why I therefore wanted to create some videos around the Gambit system, as I feel there are plenty of opportunities to improve your chances of success as you progress through the game by using the system in ways that you perhaps weren't aware of. For this video, we're going to be focusing on the fundamentals of the Gambit system, running through what various terms mean, how to create proper phasing for your Gambits, and the differences between the different types of Gambits that are available to you in the Zodiac Age. As I'm running through, I will therefore offer some basic individual Gambits that you can set up to make things a little easier, but it won't be too detailed this time around. Before we kick things off though, I do want to do a small run through about why the Gambit system was created in the first place, because I think it's important to understand its roots and its intended application. With combat in Final Fantasy XII changing significantly compared to the previous iterations of the ATB system, the aim of the developers was to essentially create a single player offline experience. However, whereas in online games where your party members are controlled by other people, with Final Fantasy XII, the developers felt it would be far too difficult to have the player control all three characters in real time, and they therefore wanted to try and alleviate that stress. As a result, Hiroaki Ito, the game's director, decided to repurpose the enemy combat routines he had created previously for Final Fantasy IV way back in the SNES era. It's a story that's been told in the past, but Hiroaki Kato, the producer on the Zodiac Age, recently recanted it, noting that Final Fantasy IV's battle system was already built around the core concept of Gambit-like mechanics that controlled the enemy AI behind the scenes and allowed them to adapt to different situations. They weren't too sure how it was going to turn out when they implemented it within Final Fantasy XII, but I hope you can all agree that the end result is pretty awesome. Alright, so now that we know where the roots of Gambits lie, creating subroutines for your characters to perform certain actions should the desired situation occur, let's run through exactly how Gambits play out. Now, there are four important parts that the Gambit system is constructed from. Firstly, we have the target, then there's the criteria, the action to be performed, and the priority of the overall directive. To give an example of how this plays out in practical terms, you might have a Gambit set up like so. If an ally, the target, drops below 70% health, the criteria, then use a potion, the action, and do it before all other Gambits, the priority. Now, despite my example playing out in that order, priority is actually very important. I don't want to say it's the most important aspect of a Gambit, as if you incorrectly set one of the other areas then things won't go how you planned either, but having the wrong ordering can make your Gambits fall down pretty quickly, and sometimes it might not be as obvious as, say, accidentally setting your Gambit to cast Cure on an enemy as opposed to an ally. For example, if you had the above Gambit as a lower priority than, say, attacking the nearest enemy, then they would never perform the Gambit while there are enemies around. It's why it's therefore best to place your Gambits into some sort of phasing. Of course, things can change depending on the situation you're encountering, but in general, you want to have your Gambits set up so that those related healing and general curative actions take priority over those actions associated to combat, which would then take priority over non-essential actions. This way, casting something like Protect or Libra, a non-essential action, won't take preference over attacking an enemy or even reviving a party member who's been taken out of action. However, it is dependent on your current situation. Having Protect on a character may be very essential, for example, if you're squaring off against a very difficult boss, but it might not be essential if you're doing some generic farming. Just be conscious of the situation and be mindful of the fact that you can switch things around accordingly. In terms of the target itself, you only have a few different options here: self, ally, or foe. These are then combined with a criteria to ensure that things get much more efficient. Foe is pretty clear cut as to who it targets, and while self and ally are pretty clear too, it can be a bit more ambiguous as to why you'd use one over the other. However, there are clear reasons when you start thinking about efficiencies. To give one practical example, let's look at the non-essential buff phase. Your job setup may make it possible for multiple characters to learn the same buff spell, such as haste or protect. Now you could have it set up so that one of your characters applies the spell to everyone, which would be done using the ally any protect gambit setup. However, there are a few inefficiencies with this approach. Firstly, think about the time it would take for one character to cast the protect spell 3 times, as opposed to having each individual character cast it on themselves. Secondly, you've then got the potential repercussions to MP should this happen on a regular basis. It's therefore much more efficient to have it spread across 3 characters than have it taken from one individual pool. This would then be achieved by having each individual character have the equivalent self-protect gambit setup. But again, this approach is situational. If, for example, you don't have 3 characters who have unlocked the license that enables you to use haste, which in the Zodiac Age is quite feasible, then you'd instead need to stick with using the ally setup instead of self setup. Likewise, if one of your characters has learned haste scar, then you'd want to apply another setup entirely. Next, we of course have the criteria that leads to a gambit taking place. This is perhaps the most extensive area, as there are quite a few different aspects to consider. You can perform gambits based on who your own characters are targeting, who the enemy is targeting amongst your allies, how strong the enemies are, but also how weak they are, how much health you or your enemies have, what status effects characters or enemies have been afflicted by, and also resistances to the different elements. It means there's a lot of room for interpretation. For example, one question could be, should you heal an ally when they're down to 70% health or 60% health? Honestly, it will really depend on your level of comfort. You can also set up gambits to remove status effects by using, for example, the ally status equals confuse gambit, but there are only a finite amount of gambits you can set, so you'd need to decide which are more important for you at that moment in time. Anyway, once you've actually set some gambits up, you'll notice that they are pretty intuitive in how they perform. Although it might not be apparent at face value, many of them have functions that make them automatically understand the current situation. For example, if you set up the aforementioned self-protect gambit, it will only be actioned if the character does not already have the protect status on them, as opposed to just casting the spell repeatedly, wasting all your MP. There are also mechanics to stop 2 characters performing the same action when it's not required, such as using a Phoenix Down to revive a downed ally. Now it's important to remember that if you're playing for the first time, you don't get access to the Gambit system straight away. Instead, you're introduced to the system when you run into Balthier and Fran for the first time, as together with Varn, they look to try and escape the Imperial forces in the Gramsynth waterway. At this point, what you can do with Gambits is quite limited, but once you get past this and have access to shops, things can start to seem quite daunting. Unlike in the original game where Gambits were purchased from different shops and there was more of a staged approach to how you acquired them, in the Zodiac Age they are all available instantly, and in total there are 249 different Gambits. For this iteration of the game, they've also added in some new Gambits so players can get a bit more creative with their Gambit strategies. There are now 67 ally Gambits in the Zodiac Age, as opposed to 63 in the original game, with new Gambits being added to this category, allowing you to perform actions relating to the number of enemies present. Whereas there used to be 115 foe Gambits, there are now 131. Again, additions have been made here relating to actions performed depending on the number of enemies present, but Gambits have also been added around performing actions based on who enemies are targeting. You can also now perform actions if enemies are targeting specific characters, and if enemies themselves are or are not being targeted by someone in the party. With self Gambits, there used to be 44, but there are now 51 in the Zodiac Age. Again, the additional focus here is around performing actions based on the number of foes present, as well as who's targeting what. Now, generally Gambits aren't that expensive in isolation, costing between 50 and 300 gil, but purchasing every single one will cost you around 27,000 gil. So that's a general overview of the Gambit system. If you're new to Final Fantasy XII, I really hope you found it useful. I'm hoping to create 2 more videos after this one to talk about some basic Gambit setups and some more advanced Gambit setups, so keep your eyes peeled for both of them. Either way, how have you been finding the Gambit system so far? Is it as good as you remembered? And if you're experiencing it for the first time, how do you think it ranks in the pantheon of Final Fantasy battle systems? Let us know in the comments below, and of course if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. If you'd also like to see this channel continue to grow and recommend videos for us to talk about, why not consider checking out our Patreon at patreon.com/ffunion. These amazing folks have already done so, and they have access to some pretty cool stuff, so why not join them? Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I hope you've enjoyed the video and I hope you're enjoying the Zodiac Age. I'll see you next time.